Welcome back to Radio Free Market. I'm Zoe Russell, the guest host today, and Dr. Hunt Tooley is our guest. We were just discussing the structure of the first central bank, the Bank of England, which basically is similar to every central bank that exists today. Can you continue telling us about the structure of the Bank of England?
Well, I'd really like to start there and then move on to other banks too, because really this after the 1790s, this whole idea of the central bank as a kind of way of as a you might say a kind of tool of the government to control the economy. That spread to other countries, so that the Dutch set up a central bank, and about a few years later, in 1718, the Royal Bank of France was founded, and gradually the great powers set up these banks that would act as a central bank. But of course, in terms of inflation, one of the crucial points here was the use of paper currency, which was introduced in the 17th century. It was introduced at a few moments in earlier history, but basically it's a 17th century. It's something that happened in the 1600s, and so there are these times in the 1700s when there's widespread experimentation with it, almost always leading to a vast inflation that we call a hyperinflation, where the paper money was just printed, and then the business cycle ensued, and there was a huge crash. The currency was whatever it was ruined and debased and totally depreciated, along the lines of what happens today in Zimbabwe or Argentina or some other place.
We're told that one of the jobs of the Federal Reserve is to control inflation, but I guess it's control inflation to the point where we don't notice it too much. It's still a steady stream of income for the government.
Well, I do think that that's the lesson that central banks have learned over the centuries, and that is to, in other words, if inflation and in part of the Austrian theory of inflation is, of course, that as the government is printing up the money or expanding the currency, that basically there's a kind of theft that's going on, this legal plunder that Bastiat talked about. And what happens in inflation is that if you steal too much, for example, in the case of Zimbabwe today, you get the government of Robert Mugabe, which is just you might say unashamed at its theft in many ways. I mean, not just in inflationary ways, but in taxation and confiscation and all the other ways the government can increase its finances. But in the case of Zimbabwe, the second greatest inflation that ever occurred is just behind us. Maybe there's another one in the future, and the government has, by these means, and Mugabe personally have really just gained billions of dollars worth of loot from all that. So yes, the more sophisticated central banks in modern times have taken these lessons from the great inflation in France, from the Mississippi bubble in France, from the greenback episode in America in the 1860s and 1870s, from the German inflation after World War I. They've taken these lessons and said, okay, well, let's not take so much that it destroys the system. And essentially, that's not the message of Keynesian thought, of the Keynesian thought on the issue of inflation, but it is the result. Let's not take too much so that people don't quite realize that wealth is being transferred from people's wallets to government coffers.
Right. And one of the most common patterns for the government to inflate and transfer wealth is to fund a war effort, and the sneaky transfer of property and wealth from private individuals to the state went hand in hand with the new mindset of the late 19th century Europe. There was a buildup of national pride, of seeing oneself as part of a group rather than an individual, and they lobbied the government for protection of their said group. And this progression away from liberty is really what pushed the world to the brink of World War I. So what kind of precedents did World War I establish in terms of government control and a government command economy?
I like your summary there very much, Zoe. That's a good way to put this. In a way, inflation was always connected in one way or the other with war, and indeed paper currencies were usually in the 1600s and 1700s connected with war. In these cases in France that I've mentioned, Henry VIII's debasement earlier on. So there's a real connection there anyway, because wars cost so much money. I mean, it's basically the most expensive human activity. So what that means is that once you get a huge, enormously destructive war in prospect, as Europeans had in 1914, then the fact of the matter is that most European finance specialists just didn't see how it could be paid for at all. But luckily or unluckily luckily for the state and unluckily for others, governments figured out how to expropriate, how to extract wealth from people to such a degree that huge war could be fought with all its unbelievable expenses, and inflation was one of the tools. I mean, you get down to it, and governments can confiscate money to put in their treasury. Governments can tax people, they can borrow. I mean, there are numerous ways that governments can obtain wealth. But the great thing about inflation is that unlike taxes and confiscation, that not many people really know about it. It's a secret kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. And here's where the propaganda comes in. I mentioned at the beginning that governments always try to blame this on somebody else, and it's perfect because you can say, well, prices are rising and we don't know what's going on. Could be those evil farmers. This happened in Germany. There's a whole in 1914-15. There's a whole episode where the government blamed farmers for increasing pork prices and increasing bread prices and so forth. And so a lot of city folks began to hate the farmers, and there was a big, actually killing off of pigs in 1915, but I won't go into that. In the midst of war, they slaughtered several million pigs. But this propaganda then covers over the fact that the government is in fact transferring money. So in World War I, all governments inflated their currency. At the end of the war, prices were up by a factor of 10 in France, factor of 8 or 9 in England, a factor of 20 or 25 in Germany, about the same in Austria. So everybody has inflated the currency during the war, in addition to borrowing and doing other means of carrying out other means of getting revenues. But so this is a really important point that you've made, that inflation is associated with war. It doesn't always happen in a kind of direct relationship, but frequently after the war, the chickens come home to roost, and then there is often an even greater inflation after the war, oftentimes hyperinflation. So we have the example of Germany in the period 1918 to 1923. There's this huge inflation, enormous. Hungary at the same time has the greatest inflation that is on record anywhere. And then after World War II, we also have inflation in Germany and Japan and China and other places. So it certainly is true that inflation is very much connected with war, especially the hyperinflationary type.